A Lies of P DLC, temat, który gdzieś tam przez ostatnie miesiące się trochę pojawiał, trochę był na ustach dziennikarzy growych i tak dalej, ale nie jakoś mocno, bo nikt jeszcze nie grał, nie wiedzieliśmy z czym to się je, widzieliśmy tylko jakieś drobne wywiady z dyrektorem studia, który mówił, że to jest taka wersja reżyserska Lies of P, że z braku czasu i pieniędzy nie mogli zrobić wszystkiego, dosłownie wszystkiego, co by chcieli, a bardzo im zależy na tej grze, bardzo im zależy na świecie, który wykreowali i w końcu to DLC im na to pozwoli. To DLC w ogóle było zapowiadane, że ma być na 20 godzin dla doświadczonego gracza, co jest bardzo dużym czasem, biorąc pod uwagę, że sama gra jest za pierwszym przejściem była chyba na jakieś 40, także mega duży DLC się szykuje. Może jest to przestrzelona liczba, może nie, ale co się zmieniło, moi drodzy, od tego czasu? Ludzie zagrali w Lies of P Overture, czyli DLC nadchodzące i mamy 2 materiały do obejrzenia. Obejrzymy je sobie teraz. Zajostorm nagrał, bo zagrał i tak samo IGN. Także te 2 materiały sobie obejrzymy. Widzę, że tutaj chyba będzie faktycznie gameplay z tego DLC pokazany, także super. No i co? Pierwsze wrażenia ludzi.
Alright, what's going on, guys? I had the opportunity to get hands-on with Lies of P Overture. I got to play the game for 2 hours, going through the first level up to the first boss, which you will be seeing on screen.
2 godziny to nie jest jakoś mega dużo, ale z drugiej strony, jeżeli dali pograć 2 godziny jako taki kawałek DLC-ka, można zobaczyć w jakim kierunku poszli. Jeden z największych minusów Lies of P, który ludzie zauważali, to że level design był zbyt prosty, że te lokacje były zbyt korytarzowe, że to nie wymagało praktycznie żadnej eksploracji i metroidwaniowości tam nie było i tego ludziom brakowało po prostu w stosunku do pozostałych gier z gatunku. Więc może po tej lokacji już widać jakieś zmiany.
And then playing the game's new boss rush mode and fighting 3 other new bosses. In that 2 hours, I managed to beat all of the content provided on the maximum difficulty provided, and I was told I was the only person to do so aside from one other earlier in the day. Now the reason I say that is because I used to absolutely suck at Lies of P, but over the last year in my free time, I've been diving back into this game on New Game Plus, and I found a newfound appreciation for it, and I will admit, pretty much all of my past grievances about the game were skill issues. Now, fortunately, with the DLC, you don't need me to tell you how good the base game is, you already know that. Overture is more of the best of Lies of P, and we have a lot of content to discuss, a lot of content coming with this DLC, and you already heard me mention a little bit of it. Boss rush, difficulties, that's just the tip of the iceberg. We have a lot to break down.
Fajnie.
But the best place to start is with what is Lies of P Overture. Lies of P Overture is of course a new DLC for the base game of Lies of P, but even without purchasing for $29.99 all the new content, there is still going to be a pretty big
$29? To nie jest wcale dużo, jak za DLC, które ma być całkiem spore. Jak na te czasy, nie powiedziałbym, że jest źle. Pewnie u nas to będzie jakieś, to będzie 150 zł. No taka trochę taniej niż DLC do Eldena.
big overhaul to the base game, which we will break down later
Czekaj,
on.
co?
But there is still going to be a pretty big overhaul to the base game, which
Okej,
we will
dobra.
break down later
Podstawowa
on.
gra
But
jest
the new
zruszona.
content of Overture is a prequel to the setting of the base game, exploring the days right before the Puppet Frenzy outbreak and delving into more secrets of the alchemists. Now, since we were only allowed to play the first level, the actual full plot of the DLC was not revealed to us, but as we've already seen with the trailer and the descriptions online, we'll be fighting alongside the fabled legendary Stalker, facing off against even more powerful enemies to unravel the dark secrets hidden in the past. Now, they say these are the final days of beauty in Crot, but as you can clearly see, from the very beginning of this DLC, things are already twisted out of recognition. Now, Overture adds many new weapons, Legion arms, skills, items, bosses, pretty much more of everything.
No to
And
jest
I tried out
oczywiste.
quite a bit of it. I didn't get to use everything yet, but man, the stuff I did use was absolutely awesome. Those 2 hours flew by so fast, I was not ready to quit. But I
Te bronie wyglądają na dużo bardziej kreatywne pod kątem kombosów do tworzenia. Widać, że tutaj jest znacznie więcej przyłożenia w animacjach, w różnorodności wykonywanych kombo. Widziałem łuk w ogóle i ja myślałem, że to będzie to narzędzie Legionu, czy tam ramię Legionu, które po prostu będzie raz na jakiś czas strzelać z łuku, ale to jednak jest pełnoprawna broń po user interfejsie, zauważyłem. Także zupełnie nowe sposoby na rozegranie tej gry się nam pokazują, co też może zachęcić ludzi do grania po raz kolejny w podstawkę. No i większa różnorodność enemisów chyba tutaj już, nawet po tych kilkudziesięciu sekundach i innych materiałach promocyjnych, także super.
got far enough to where they had to stop me, saying I reached the end of the allowed content, and let me tell you about it. The first level of Overture is Crot Zoo, a menagerie of different animals twisted by the corruption. It starts off with the player walking through this snowy forest. We didn't get to see how the player ended up here, but Jiminy does mention something about a stargazer, and putting together the context clues that Crot Zoo burned down a long time ago, he of course deduces that that stargazer transported us to the past. Now right off the bat, with the new enemies we're facing, they inflict a new status effect called Freeze, which if applied fully, drains the player's health and slows their movements. And that was an absolute pain to deal with when inflicted. You don't want to get caught by that. The build we were provided with was a balanced quality build with stats high enough to wield all of the new weapons. The one that we started with was the new Gunblade, a great sword with a cannon on it, and I had been warned pretty early on that it was a bit underpowered from people that played before me, so I opted to switch the weapon out and tried out this new massive pinwheel weapon. Now honestly, I thought it was ugly, but the moveset was pretty cool, so I kept the weapon's handle, but threw on a blade that did the most damage, and I'm not gonna lie to you guys, this thing was absolutely busted. It's called the Anguished Guardian blade, and I combined it with the Maniac's pinwheel handle. It looks a lot like Laxasia's sword, and the skill is also very similar, as we'll talk about soon. The ability on this blade coats the player in lightning and gives you a new special dodge, while also buffing the weapon with lightning damage as well. And this was just putting out some insane numbers. That came in especially handy.
Okej, czyli też zmiany w potencjalnym movemencie bronie mogą wprowadzać, to jest spoko. To co jeszcze tutaj widziałem, podoba mi się, że przeciwnicy też mają nowe rzeczy do zaoferowania, nie? Czyli nie tylko nowe movesety, ale właśnie nowy status efekt choćby. To jest bardzo dobra zmiana, bardzo dobry dodatek.
The boss fight of this level, which we'll talk about later on. We also got to try out 2 of the new Legion arms, one of which was a shotgun that could be charged up, and when fully charged would one-shot most of the smaller enemies, but could also do big stagger damage to a boss. The other launched these little shurikens, and could be charged up to shoot 2 at once, and they would stay suspended in the air doing damage over time. Now, I'm not gonna lie, neither one of these felt particularly strong, but perhaps we find more utility for them when we actually get to use them at an extended period in the final version of the DLC.
Nie, domyślam się, że będzie zastosowanie do tego. Shurikeny, które zostają w miejscu, będzie można fajnie pewnie skillowo ogrywać, przytrzymując przeciwnika w tym samym miejscu, co cię zmusza do dobrego dodżowania, do poruszania się w odpowiednim kierunku, żeby trzymać go cały czas w polu zadającym damage. Fajne.
But I opted to use the shotgun in my run. But getting back to the level itself, the zoo has you facing off against many different kinds of corrupted animals.
To, co mi się bardzo podoba, to to, że tutaj jest masa krwi, która super kontrastuje z tym białym śniegiem. Bardzo fajna zabawa kolorami tutaj.
You start off fighting these twisted mandrills, and these guys are pretty easy. They staggered with every hit of the weapon, but there are some bigger ones later on, but they're not too bad either. I will tell you what gave me the hardest time were the corrupted kangaroos. The small ones can turn into Sonic the Hedgehog and roll around in a ball, but the big kangaroos can pull off some crazy combos by hopping towards you and kicking you with their legs, and their tails have some insane reach on them. They killed me a few times. There are also mutated elephants, giraffes, wolves, among other things. But you get...
Zoo to jest bardzo fajny kierunek, no bo jednak zwierząt masz całą masę, co daje ci taką różnorodność mobów w tej jednej lokacji, że to jest szok.
The idea. It's a zoo. What is cool though is that you can actually read a lot of the plaques throughout the zoo. Just a cool detail. Now, like many of the other levels in Lies of P, the actual layout itself is fairly straightforward. If you play the level like a Roomba checking every single corner, eventually the only one that will continue on is the main path.
Okej, czyli level design dalej wydaje się dość prosty. Kurde.
The others will lead you to treasure chest and new loot. And of course there are shortcuts back to the main Stargazer that are not hard to find either. This is just only the opening level of the DLC. I'm sure it expands a lot later on. But as
no właśnie, nie? Bo to, że to jest początek DLC-ka, może też nie chcą cię przytłoczyć od razu, ale no, istnieje obawa, że jednak to będzie wyglądało tak jak podstawka. No mówię, to jest jedyny minus tak naprawdę tej gry, poza sporym jej ułatwieniem, które chyba będzie zmodyfikowane, o czym Zajostrom zaraz powie. Ale no, pod kątem level designu tam było kiepsko.
As far as the Crot Zoo level goes, it's pretty standard with the early levels of the base game in terms of layout. But now let's talk about the main boss of this level. This is the Tyrannical Predator, a giant corrupted crocodile who likes to do a lot of charge attacks. He does have attacks where he can slam his jaw down and spin with his tail. The tail attack caught me quite a bit. That one was hard to see coming. He also has an attack where he'll open his mouth and charge forward, and the timing on that can be hard to pinpoint also. Now I gotta be be honest, this boss was pretty easy. I managed to beat it first try. Honestly, I was doing too much damage to it to the point where I thought something was wrong. I was expecting a phase 2. Hopefully I have the footage of that. We were allowed to record the level portion, so hopefully you guys can see that, because the lightning buff...
Fajnie wygląda ten przeciwnik i to, że jest duży, wcale nie przeszkadza w walce z nim, bo nie jest tak duży, żeby wywalał za kadr.
That weapon I was talking about came in especially handy in this fight. That special dodge was extremely useful in getting out of the way of his charges. But I do think this serves as a great introductory boss into the DLC, because the other ones we got to fight were much harder. But after beating the Tyrannical Predator, it opened up into a greenhouse level where the main enemies were these feminine puppets. And these were pretty tough, but since I was using a special weapon with lightning attributes, it was able to exploit their elemental weakness, which is something to keep in mind, especially on the later boss fights. But that level itself was pretty short. I ended up pretty quickly at the next boss arena, which was for Markiona, the Puppeteer of Death, who we'll talk about in a minute. However, that was when they came up to me and stopped me, telling me that was the end of the allowed content, and I still had about 15 minutes left to play around. Now, what I ended up doing with that remaining time was trying out the bow, and I've got some pretty mixed feelings about it. As a primary weapon, I don't think it's very good. The range is pretty limited. You do have infinite ammo, but it doesn't seem to put out that much damage. But as a backup weapon, when you need to put some distance between yourself and the enemies, that's where the utility lies. And the big charge shot skill you have is pretty cool too. The other hour of gameplay we got was in the game's boss rush mode. Now I'll talk about the details of this mode real quick before we actually get into the bosses, in case you don't want to be spoiled on what exactly those bosses are. When Overture releases, if you go to the Hotel Crot Stargazer, at the very bottom there will be a new boss rush mode. This will add the option to do individual fights as well as gauntlets with various difficulty levels ranging from 1 through 6. And when we loaded in, the default difficulty there was 3. In order to unlock difficulties 4, 5, and 6, you had to beat them on the lower levels first. And considering 3 was the one we loaded in with, that was likely the level of the base game. Now what's interesting is that we never really got a straight answer on that, because they said the difficulties themselves are not directly scaling damage and HP. There are other factors at play when changing the difficulty. Again,
I to mi się bardzo podoba. Bossy mogą dostawać chyba nowe mechaniki. Jezus Maria, jak dobrze. Ja nie wiem, czemu wszystkie gry souls-like'owe obligatoryjnie po prostu nie dodają trybu boss rushowego. Przecież ludzie uwielbiają wracać do tych walk, a nie zawsze chcą wracać do przechodzenia całej gry od nowa, żeby powalczyć z jednym bossem. Więc po przejściu gry faktycznie fajnie by było umożliwić ludziom właśnie opcję zawalczenia z konkretnym bossem albo zrobienia sobie takiego gauntleta wieży wyzwań z Mortal Kombat. To jest mega dobre. W Sekiro dodali to z update'em i to jest bardzo, bardzo fajne.
Again, we didn't get any specifics on this, but that's what they said. It's not just a straight scaling factor. Now, there were 3 new bosses to choose from in that boss rush. I won't name them yet, but I did manage to beat all 3 of them on the level 3 difficulty, which again seemed to be the closest to the standard base game. We were not allowed to record this part of the playtest. And another part of it that was not open to us that they described to us were boss gauntlets, called death marches. This is where you can create your own boss rush in any order, with a minimum of 3 bosses going up to every boss in the game. And you can change the difficulty on those as well. Now, I don't know if there are going to be pre-made death marches that you can unlock special rewards by completing or not. I hope there are, but we did not learn about that in the event. Now, here's where I'm going to talk about the new bosses, so here is a spoiler warning. If you do not want to know about the new bosses that were not shown in the first level, then go ahead and skip ahead to where I talk about the new game update. But here's your warning. The first boss in the boss rush that I went up against was Markiona, the Puppeteer of Death. We saw her in the trailer for Overture. She is the puppeteer who has this sort of angel puppet that fights alongside her. This was a fun fight. There's a lot that's going on trying to balance the puppet that she commands, while also fighting off against her when she uses these big blue orbs to attack. But there's a really good rhythm, because when the puppet is about to attack, the strings will glow red, and there wasn't really a moment where she was attacking with the orbs while also commanding the puppet at the same time. There was a good back and forth, so it didn't feel unfair. What makes the fight confusing though, is that oftentimes when you're fighting Markiona herself, parrying or dodging her combos with the blue orbs, the puppet will attack from off screen. So you really have to be watching the strings themselves, and as soon as they glow red, I would just hold my block. And that worked out really well. I was using the Eye of Ouroboros, and there was...
Pytanie, czy to nie wejdzie na rejony bossa irytującego. No ale się okaże.
Wasn't a time when I was just blocking that her attacks broke my posture. So when the puppet would attack from off screen, I would block and then hit Markiona and get all my health back.
Ale to jest fajny sposób na stworzenie 2 źródeł obrażeń, niekoniecznie wchodząc na terytorium tworzenia duo bossa, które są nieznośne i w większości Souls-like'ów po prostu nie wychodzą dobrze. Więc tutaj mamy coś w stylu Lorian Lothric, ale z jednym paskiem zdrowia i to wydaje się być sensowne, tak powiem.
Not focusing on the puppet and instead treating it as a single fight against Markiona with some off-screen attacks. To me, that made it a lot more manageable. Now, when you get her about halfway, she will do a big attack with the puppet where it glows bright orange and does a few slam attacks and then causes a giant explosion in the middle of the arena. This causes Markiona to go into a more aggressive state, if I remember correctly. So if you can survive that midpoint phase change, then the fight goes back to being what it was before. I was able to beat her in about 5 or 6 tries. She wasn't that hard, and as soon as you beat Markiona, the puppet dies too, which is why I was kind of saying I just ignored the puppet and treated it as just some off-screen attacks that would occasionally come in. It was a very fun fight, and I think for the second boss in the DLC, it's a good difficulty, and out of the 3 we got to fight, it was my favorite by far. The second boss in the boss rush was the two-faced Overseer. This was a really big dude we fought down in some kind of alchemist laboratory, and he had some kind of jar on his head with a green liquid. Now he was much taller than the player, and wielded a big club. Now this fight was pretty straightforward. He didn't have a big moveset, but every one of his swings, if blocked and not parried, would absolutely decimate my stamina, and I'm really not that good at parrying, so I opted to primarily dodge. Now this guy also had a ton of health. His attacks were a combination of a lot of sweeps and smashes with the club, and they were pretty well telegraphed, so they weren't hard to see coming. But again, if you got hit, it would do a ton of damage. At around the quarter health mark, he would transition into this state where he's glowing red and becomes much more aggressive. And he begins this like 10-hit combo with the club where he's smashing it over and over and over again. Now, if you can manage to parry those, it's an excellent way to break down his posture.
Właśnie chciałem powiedzieć, że takie kombosy, one są ogólnie zabójcze w grach Souls-like'owych i z reguły lubimy je zonować, ale Lies of P bardzo nagradza dobre parowanie. Tam szybko się zbija posturę w ten sposób. To trochę jak na Laksasji, nie? Ona też ma to combo tam kilkunastohitowe. Jak ogarniesz jak to parować, to można ją mega zeszmacić.
But for me that sucks at parrying, I just ran away. Now, since he was much faster in this state, honestly I found his normal combos to almost be easier to manage and block and dodge, because as soon as the telegraph would appear, that's when you do it. But this more aggressive state would last for again about a quarter of his health before he went back to the other, slower one. And that was kind of the gimmick of this fight. Every 25% or so, he would go back and forth between these states. It doesn't change much. This was a pretty straightforward fight, but with a lot of health and doing a lot of damage, it's just a matter of not making mistakes. And I was able to bring him down in about 7 or 8 tries. But the final boss we got to fight in the boss rush was the Anguished Guardian of the Ruins. And we saw this guy a bit in the trailer for Overture. This was definitely the hardest of the 3.
O Jezu, ty, to wygląda trochę jak ten biskup, nie? Ale fajny kontrast kolorów znowu, ataków do modelu. Fajnie to wygląda. Nie, Lies of P artystycznie rewelacyjna giera.
Several different reasons for that. This is one of those fights where he takes up a giant portion of the arena. If you manage to get under him, you're not going to be able to see anything.
Okej, czyli to jest dosłownie biskup fight, który jest za duży, zbyt dziwny, arena jest niezbyt dostosowana do niego, to nie będzie pewnie taki fajny fight. Coś czuję, że tego nie będę lubił. Mi się w Lies of P ogólnie te abominacje mega ciężko się z nimi mierzyło.
Kind of battling the camera alongside the boss. Now, to balance that out, the boss really only has a handful of attacks total. So after you've done your first, maybe your second try, you're gonna have seen everything. It's just a matter of, like I said, actually being able to see what's happening. So the best way to approach this fight that I found was just standing right in front of his face. He can do a big fury attack where he stands up real tall and then slams down, but the timing on that was very easy to figure out. He can do an attack where he spins and then slams the ground with one of his hands. That has about 2 hits. There's another where he does a swipe with the spear and then follows up with 2 quick jabs. And then there's one where he jumps across the arena with a giant spear from above. And I'm pretty sure that's it for phase 1. In phase 2, the giant spear that he's holding above becomes imbued with this holy light. And now attacks with that spear do a giant explosion afterward. He then gains 2 new attacks where he fires...
Okej, ale to jest dobry sposób na zrobienie drugiej fazy, czyli modyfikujemy bossa w zakresie jego istniejących ruchów, dodajemy nowe, a nie tworzymy z tego zupełnie nowego boss fightu, nie? To ludzie raczej preferują ewolucję bossa a nie zmianę w drugiego.
a laser from his mouth, but aside from that, everything remains the same. And it's just a matter of watching out for those lasers and remembering the follow-up explosion from the spear. Now, despite the big size of the boss, I don't think it did as much damage as the second one. Except for the lasers. The lasers absolutely decimated my health bar. But I managed to bring down this boss in about 10 to 12 tries, I think. These bosses were fun, definitely not as hard as like Lexatia or Simon Manus, or even I would say King of Puppets and the Romeo fight. If I had to give a direct comparison to difficulty, I'd say something like Green Monster of the Swamp. Both phases. Now, I'm not...
Dobra, gościu, to żeś ciekawe porównanie zrobił. Przecież potwór z bagien był kurwa najgorszym bossem w tej grze pod kątem trudności. Nie wiem, może tylko ja jestem jakiś dziwny, ale kurwa potwór z bagien, nigdy więcej nie chciałbym z tym zawalczyć, a będę musiał niestety. To jest tak tragiczny boss fight dla mnie do ogarnięcia, ja po prostu nie wiem, gdzie ja mam się patrzeć w tej walce. A, daj spokój. Czyli raczej są dość trudne, skoro porównuję to do gdzieś pomiędzy potworem z bagna a Romeo, nie?
Saying the whole DLC is not going to be that hard, because I doubt we've seen the best it has to offer. But while these three were fun fights, they were around the middle in terms of difficulty. But now that we've gone over the new content of Overture that we were allowed to look at, another thing shipping alongside the DLC is a massive quality of life update. Now, while we were not provided the details of this update in full, there were a few things that I noticed that were new. Now, whether these are unlocked in the DLC or part of the new update, I'm not sure, but there were a few new things. Firstly, when leveling up, you will have on the bottom of your screen all of your ergo chunks available to use in that menu. So you no longer have to exit and go into your inventory and then come back. It's all in one place now. There are also now...
Ja bardzo lubię, jak faktycznie twórca orientuje się, że zrobił pewne rzeczy niewygodnie. Takie drobne małe zmiany, nawet w user interfejsie właśnie czy coś, i decyduje się przy jakimś właśnie DLC-ku, jak jest dobra okazja, zupdate'owanie dosłownie wszystkiego nawet w base grze. Nie musiałby tego robić, bo ludzie już się zdążyli pewnie przyzwyczaić, ale robi to, żeby gra była pod każdym możliwym względem, w którym może sobie poradzić, idealna. Mega szanuję takie zmiany.
New difficulty modes for the base game. The first two are...
Kurde, ja nie wiem, co myśleć o poziomach trudności. W sensie, jeżeli one faktycznie modyfikują mechaniki przeciwników, to jest to jakieś ciekawe rozwiązanie, które otwiera nawet możliwości rozgrywania gry ponownie i zachęca do tego. Ale jeżeli to jest modyfikacja statystyk, to mamy do czynienia z Kazanem i to nie wyszło najlepiej.
Called Butterfly's Guidance and Awakened Puppet, and therefore a more casual experience, making the game easier. The default difficulty is now called Legendary Stalker. Now, if you feel some type of way about easy mode, according to them, the feedback has been extremely positive, so ultimately it will lead more players to playing the game who otherwise wouldn't.
Znaczy, no pewno, no. Tylko kurde, Lies of P dostało dużo nerfów, więc jeżeli aktualny poziom trudności jest tym trudnym, to nie wyobrażam sobie, jak mają wyglądać poziomy easy. Teraz ta gra serio jest dość prosta.
And that's just the reality of it. But the game itself has been out for a while now, so if they're gonna do it, alongside the DLC is a good choice. Now, some other things I noticed were that there were several new elements for the grindstone, doing things like critical hit damage and several other things that I hadn't seen before, but I'll be honest, in my playthrough I didn't use all of them. I got fire, lightning, and acid and didn't really touch the rest, so I'm not sure which ones are all new and which aren't, but I did notice there were quite a few new ones. Another thing is that in our playthrough we were wearing more rings than should be allowed, either 5 or 6, again I can't remember off the top of my head right now, but there were definitely new ring slots available, and that alone right there is make you way more powerful. But whether that comes through a new upgrade in the quartz tree or is just automatically unlocked when the update rolls out, we don't yet know. But those are all the changes I can remember and I had written down. There may be others you notice in the footage, and of course I don't believe the boss rush mode is tied to the DLC, so either way, if you have the base game and don't purchase the DLC, you will still have that new content to look forward to. And I'm sure this patch is going to bring a lot more. But that is pretty much everything I got to experience with Lies of P Overture. This is going to be good. It's more Lies of P, and that's probably the best compliment I can give it.
Ja już po tym gameplayu, co teraz tutaj był pokazany i po materiałach promocyjnych, uważam, że to DLC będzie po prostu prawdopodobnie warte swojej ceny. Jeżeli to będzie około 130-150 zł za kilka, może kilkanaście boss fightów, bardzo różnorodne tereny, ze sporą różnorodnością przeciwników, nowymi itemami, nowymi buildami, które widać, że w ogóle są bardzo dopracowane pod kątem animacji. I jeszcze do tego masz zachętę do wrócenia do podstawki, bo są nowe jakieś boss rush mody i inne rzeczy, quality of life zmiany, mega spoko to wygląda.
The base game was already so good. Now what we experienced was only a taste of it. There's gonna be a lot more here, especially with that $29.99 price tag. You know you're gonna have plenty of content. But y'all let me know down below, are you looking forward to Lies of P Overture? Personally, I cannot wait. I've got my New Game Plus build ready to go, but let me give a massive thank you to NeoWiz and everyone involved that provided me with this opportunity. I'm extremely grateful. But with all that, if you enjoyed today's video, be sure to leave a like on it and subscribe if you're new around here, and I will catch you in the next one.
Mega spoko. Zobaczymy. Ja się doczekać nie mogę. Tylko czemu nie mamy daty premiery, cholera jasna? To mnie zastanawia, nie? Gameplaye wychodzą, a my wiemy tylko, że Lies of P Overture wyjdzie latem. Aha, dawaj jeszcze co IGN powiedziało o tym.
In 2021, Round 8 in NeoWiz announced Lies of P, a moody Souls-like that answered the question that no one had thought to ask. What if Bloodborne was actually a Victorian reimagining of Carlo Collodi's Pinocchio? When it launched in 2023, it surprised skeptics and over-delivered in both how great its dark fantasy setting was and how incredibly fun its aggressive combat was.
To, co było bardzo dobre w Lies of P przede wszystkim i jest dalej, to, że oni potrafili stworzyć swój klimat. Że były inspiracje Bloodborne'em, ale one były przede wszystkim w kombacie, w mechanikach, które są dostępne. Oni stworzyli swoje tak naprawdę miejsce na tym rynku, bo były zupełnie inne stylistycznie wyzwania, ale i mechanicznie, movementowo. Mieliśmy do czynienia z marionetkami, które ruszały się jak prawie żaden inny przeciwnik wcześniej widziany. Potem mieliśmy ich połączenia z plugastwem, same plugastwa. Było mega fajnie przemyślane i wyróżnili się, mam wrażenie, na tle gier Miyazakiego i nie tylko.
2 years later, I got to spend some quality time with Overture, the ironically named encore of an expansion to the hit action game. And even though I didn't get to see much more than around an hour of the first stage and the new boss memories mode, it was apparent very quickly that the South Korean team is poised to overachieve yet again. Overture is a prequel to the events of Lies of P, right before the puppet frenzy starts and robotic thralls massacre everyone in the city of Crot. But as it turns out, many of the ideas for settings, weapons, etc. were actually meant for the base game, but got cut out to keep the original release from being too bloated. Round 8 game studio director Ji-won Choi told IGN...
Zostały wycięte, bo gra by była zbyt rozbudowana. Powątpiewam, żeby to były faktyczne obawy deweloperów. Pewnie po prostu nie zdążyli ich dodać. Dziwne ujęcie tego, nie? Zbyt rozbudowana gierka by była. Nie ma czegoś
Round
takiego.
8 game studio director Ji-won Choi told IGN in an interview that he and his team weren't content with letting these ideas go undeveloped and unrealized. Through a translator, he described Lies of P as finally complete with the addition of Overture.
No to, co ja wyczułem po tych wywiadach z dyrektorem, to, że jemu naprawdę zależy na tym, żeby to było takie jego dzieło, którym może się pochwalić przed samym sobą, z którego może być dumny. Że on faktycznie chce skompletować to wrażenie, że on czuje, że to jest niepełne i chce tym DLC zlepić ten obraz w całość. I nie tylko zależy mu na tym, żeby to sprzedać, bo to na pewno też, ale zależy mu na tym, żeby po prostu wiedział, że jego zadanie jest tutaj skończone i że zrobił to w pełni. Szanuję takie podejście, bo czasami gry się traktuje tylko jak pusty produkt, a tutaj widać jakieś takie artystyczne zacięcie.
Lies of P has always been associated with Bloodborne, mostly because of how it looks, but also because combat in both games adheres to Souls-like traditions, but forego key behaviors like blocking. Even releasing a big DLC well after launch to put a bow on the original project has become a From Software signature at this point. The Choice team embraces the comparison. Quote, "It's an honor to be compared to From Software," end quote. He added that it motivates the team to make something that can clear the high bar of expectation, and they can only hope that they did that with Lies of P, and will continue to do so in Overture. The first steps you take back in the boots of the titular character P is into the snow-packed region around the Crot Zoo, a building your disembodied guide Gemini seems very confused to see standing and not a pile of embers.
Yes, it is. That's Crot Zoo. How in the blazes? And I mean that literally. The zoo burned down a long time ago.
Story details are light, and the developers are staying tight-lipped about anything we haven't seen so far. After some preamble from your lantern cricket, it was very difficult not to spend a couple of seconds swinging around one of the brand new weapons in Overture. A gunblade that looks exactly like the kind Squall Leonhardt would have
Ja w
commissioned.
ogóle mam wrażenie, że ta gra, z uwagi na oświetlenie dzienne, którego było bardzo mało w podstawce, zyskuje. Gra się wydaje po prostu ładniejsza niż wcześniej.
For himself. This is one of the few new weapon types I chopped my way through this frozen menagerie with, on top of new weapons from existing types, and a pair of new, very cool Legion arms that did very different yet very effective kinds of ass-kicking. The Pale Knight, as the gunblade's called, was my main weapon against the ergo-poisoned monsters both on the outskirts of the zoo and within its walls. It has the weight and attack pattern similar to a greatsword, but its heavy attack pulls the trigger, and the double-barreled firearm attached sends lead screaming at foes. The recoil of
To jest mega dobre, żeby zdisengage'ować szybko podczas jakiegoś ataku. Daje ci to nowe okno dodżowania tak naprawdę.
these shots push P around, so it can be useful when mixed in with light attack strings to remain evasive. A trick I learned far too late in my demo was that you could actually fire the weapon again to rocket yourself back towards the bad guys for a big follow-up attack.
O,
So basically, it's the coolest weapon ever made. Another new weapon type I dabbled with is the bow, the first completely ranged weapon in the series. It felt perfect for poking smaller enemies from afar, but felt pretty incapable of making a reasonable mark on larger foes. I think with time, there's probably a way to exploit its perfect draw mechanic to menace all sorts of baddies from downrange, but I couldn't manage it in the hour I had. Another new weapon type I wish I spent more time with were a pair of long claws that shredded enemies with the kind of fury that is usually reserved
o
for
pazury
the best there is
zarąbiste,
at what he
stary.
does.
No powiem tak, te pazury wyglądają fajniej niż w Eldeniku. Dużo fajniej.
This didn't scratch the surface of weapons I glossed over that were clearly new additions to existing weapon types, but it was abundantly clear to me that people who really love the weapon customization aspect of the base game will have a lot of new toys to match together in Overture. The new Legion arms I tried out also made great additions to P's kit. My favorite was yet another gun. Double barrel.
Oho, pokaż mi upgrade'y tutaj. Legion arm that stores energy to fire shotgun shells. Charging will increase its power. Okej, charge'owanie broni. Dodżowanie podczas charge'owania umożliwione. Zwiększony damage. Fire at the perfect moment. A i perfect reload jeszcze. Spoko, czyli tak naprawdę upgrade'y broni dodają ci nowe skillowe elementy do niej, a niekoniecznie same buffy do obrażeń. Też mądrze zrobione. Perfect reload jakiś, wiesz.
Barreled and chargeable to moderate the kind of force
Rozszerza
spread
ci
and impact
możliwości.
on the bad guys. It's more a close range option, but even at half charge it made short work of all the fodder that roamed around the snowy grounds or dilapidated halls of the zoo itself. At full charge, it was a reliable tool to stun bigger foes or at least interrupt their bevy of attacks for a second. I came to the second arm late in the demo, but it was certainly a strong offensive option in its own right. It launched blades that would swirl around enemies for a short time, similar to the throwable saw blade item, but with two differences. One, it can fire multiple blades at once to do some significant damage over time to one target, and two, with a quick press of a button before releasing the flying blade, you can change the attack completely to a set of blades that dance around P instead, great for doing solid AoE damage. Speaking of targets, the cast of enemies in this section was pretty unremarkable outside in the beginning of the level, but got very interesting as we got deeper in the zone. Some bitey wolves and grabby zombies were run-of-the-mill, but standouts like some very angry kangaroos and an ergo-plagued elephant with a Resident Evil-style surprise really wowed me. I spent so much time against the last.
Chciałem powiedzieć też, jak ten redaktor, że bardzo mi się to z Resident Evilem kojarzy, zwłaszcza z 7, jak te stwory, te zwierzęta się w takie plugastwa przemieniają.
Elephant with a Resident Evil-style surprise really wowed me. I spent so much time against the ladder that I only just made it to the end of the level to see.
Właśnie to też w ogóle jest ciekawe, że zrobili poziom zoo, bo już pomijając to, co wcześniej mówiłem, że różnorodność przeciwników, nie było nigdy takiego poziomu w Soulsach. Zawsze są jakieś kanały, jakieś zamki, jakieś rezydencje, uliczki wąskie, szersze, ale nigdy zoo.
An enormous crocodile twisted by ergo.
Fajne wejście.
On that note, bosses will get a new focus in the patch for the base game that will accompany Overture with two new game modes. Battle Memories, and Death March. Death March is a straight-up boss rush, allowing you to make a playlist of at least 3 bosses and attempt to take them all down in one go. Battle Memories, meanwhile, allows you to return to old boss fights and attempt to beat them again, now in up to 5 different tiers of difficulty, each tier increasing some unique stats that these bosses gain in this mode. Rewards for conquering these tiers has been hinted at, but not elaborated on.
Okej, będzie jakaś nagroda za to. Może skiny do tego, tak jak ten, Sekiro.
I went back to one of the old bosses, the Black Rabbit Brotherhood, to see how different it was on tier 3 than my memory of them in the base game. The way they beat me and my rusty fingers to death didn't point out any real differences, but as with the rest of Lies of P, I'm sure teasing out the mystery comes with lots of experimentation.
Ten boss był nieźle zrobiony, ale ich druga wersja nieznośna strasznie. Nie jestem fanem.
Lies of P was one of the standout games of 2023, and among the best games in its action RPG subgenre not made by From Software. Overture doesn't play with the formula too much, but I found that the new ingredients it added, like the great new weapon types and fabulously freaky monsters, prove that there's never really too much of a good thing, even if it's largely the same thing.
Spoko. No to IGN nic ciekawego jakoś mocno tutaj nie dodał. Jaram się mocno. Widzowie z YouTube'a, dajcie znać, co sądzicie o DLC-ku. To, co teraz widzieliśmy, wygląda dobrze. I to, co słyszeliśmy. Naprawdę solidnie.